We have Pat Pitney, Director of Legislative Budget Office, joining us from Juneau, and we have Cliff Groh here in Anchorage. Cliff will introduce Pat, but I'll first start out with a little background and introduction of Cliff. Alaska Common Ground has held literally dozens of events related to Alaska's state financial situation, sessions on budget, taxes, our economy, and more. And there's just a list of some of those events posted. You can see they go back, 1992 is the first one on the list there. So for the last almost 30 years, and probably even longer, Alaska Common Ground has been kind of expressing concern about the long-term state budget situation and talk about going over the cliff. And I think we're starting to go over the cliff. Not the Cliff Groh, but the cliff of the budget cliff. Anyhow, board member and past chairperson Cliff Groh has taken the lead on a number of these events, including tonight's discussion with Pat. And I'll introduce Cliff here a little bit, and then he will introduce Pat. Some background on Cliff. He's been on the board of Alaska Common Ground and is a lifelong Alaskan. He is a writer who has for 4 decades studied the state's financial and fiscal situation. As a legislative assistant, Cliff played a key role in developing the 1982 legislation creating the permanent fund dividend. While serving as special assistant to the Alaska Commissioner of Revenue in 1987 to 1990, Cliff was heavily involved in a successful effort to pass legislation that raised oil taxes. In 2015, he was invited as a participant to the Walker administration's Forum on Alaska's Future, held at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and was a delegate to the 2004 Conference of Alaskans. He has taught a course at the University of Alaska Anchorage titled Navigating Alaska's Fiscal and Economic Challenges, and he ran for the legislature in 2018. Cliff authored or co-authored 4 chapters in economic books about the permanent fund dividend and Alaska fiscal policy. The Alaska Institute of Social and Economic Research published his 2018 paper on the unfunded liabilities of the public employees retirement system and teachers retirement system. Cliff is also working on a series of op-ed pieces on Alaska's fiscal situation and developing a website with his writings. In addition to his service with the Alaska Legislature and Department of Revenue, Cliff has worked as a municipal attorney, a petroleum taxation lawyer, a prosecutor, and a criminal defense lawyer. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cliff and Pat.
Well, thank you so much, Dick, and I'm pleased to be here. And we're going to do a 2-part presentation this evening. Pat's going to talk mostly about Alaska's very substantial fiscal challenge, and then I'm going to talk about our very heavy-duty economic issues, particularly in light of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm pleased to start out by introducing Pat Pitney, who is the director of the Alaska Legislative Finance Division, which is the agency of the state government which serve as the state of Alaska's nonpartisan fiscal scorekeepers. Pat's well qualified for this position, which she took this year. She previously served as the director of the Office of Management and Budget during Governor Bill Walker's tenure, and before that was a vice chancellor for administrative services at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. As a teenager, Pat won an Olympic gold medal and a very accomplished person all around. Pat, take it away on our state of Alaska's fiscal circumstances.
Well, thank you, Cliff. I really appreciate this opportunity. My mantra is, repeat and get as many people knowledgeable on the state fiscal situation as we possibly can. With that, Kari, or Kitty, do you have the presentation? Perfect. All right, so Cliff asked me to cover four components, and so if we go to page 2, we'll cover the fiscal year that we're in right now is fiscal year 20. That fiscal year ends the end of June, and then we'll be in fiscal year 21. The legislature just passed their fiscal year 21 budget before they went on recess due to the COVID virus about a month ago. So I'll talk about our fiscal reserves, address options for the growing structural deficit, and then a little bit about the federal aid that's coming into Alaska as we speak because of the CARES Act. So with that, we'll move on to the next page. So we need to address the revenue side of things, and that has been significantly volatile. I thought it was volatile when I was serving the governor in 2014 and 2015, but it's nothing compared to what we have here. And on April 6th, the Department of Revenue put out their spring forecast. And for this current fiscal year, assuming roughly a $35 a barrel oil average until the end of the fiscal year, they revised their oil price down for the current fiscal year to $51 from $63. That's $527 million in revenue loss. If we're talking about closer to the $10 and $20, well, $0, $10 and $20 a barrel oil that we're seeing, we could lose easily another $100 million from that. The 21 forecast, so the upcoming year, is $37 a barrel. That's down from $59 a barrel oil. Again, I think this is pretty optimistic for a forecast, and we need to be thinking about it being less. The production forecast is also optimistic, especially after hearing the announcement by ConocoPhillips of a reduction of 100,000 barrels of oil. The pipe Alyeska had said they were going to reduce the supply by 50,000, and then on top of that, Conoco said 100,000. I don't think those two numbers are additive, but 100,000 would be our decline in barrels of oil. So the permanent fund, the percent of market value draw, is now our largest source of revenue. The kind of normal expectation is that permanent fund would earn 7% on average, and we are using the low scenario put out by the permanent fund, which would be roughly a break even. So 0% return, which is actually in this environment pretty good and might be achievable. The non-petroleum revenue forecast by the Department of Revenue did not change hardly at all. And so I think we will see, especially in 21, a loss in fisheries tax and some other corporate tax reductions, especially like for the tour companies. Okay, next page. So what does this look like in graphic form? The red line was our fall forecast, and that started at about $5 billion in revenue, up to about $6 billion across the 10-year period. The blue line represents the spring forecast, and essentially it's between $600 and $800 million below the fall forecast for every year going forward. So essentially, we're looking at a long-term forecast of, let's say 700 million on average, less revenue every year. Next page. A little bit about our revenue makeup. So this graph provides a look at our traditional state revenue. So the blue is our petroleum revenue. The red is our everything else, non-petroleum. So that includes alcohol tax, marijuana tax, motor fuels tax, DMV receipts that aren't necessary to operate the DMV office, vehicle registration, etc. It includes some non-petroleum corporate income tax, and again, that's a lot of the cruise lines have that. So back in 2012, our oil revenue was at $9 billion and about 500 to 600 million in the non-petroleum annual revenue, state revenue. You see the collapse that happened in 15 and 16, going into 17. A small recovery in 18 and 19, and we're right back down to that collapse in our traditional revenue. So in the 14, 15, 16 time period, we started discussing the use of the permanent fund earnings. And if you turn to the next page, this graph shows the use of the permanent fund earnings. So the green bar going back to 2012 shows the amount spent on the dividend. Then in fiscal year 18, the legislature passed the percent of market value draw on the permanent fund. You can see the purple bar there. So that annual draw, that percent of market draw on the permanent fund, which is a long-term sustainable draw. If you adhere to those rules, the permanent fund over time will grow with inflation. But you have to adhere to the rules. But you can see now that that percent of market value draw, that POMV draw, makes up more than 60% of our revenue. And you can see on the blue bar that oil revenue makes up less than 20% of our costs, less than 30% of our revenue. So a significant sea change. I think a really important point here is when people say, well, we can just use money from the earnings reserve. We are using money from the earnings reserve. About $3.1 billion every year, growing with inflation and the growth of the permanent fund. Next page. So kind of putting that in context, so our total revenue in fiscal year 20 is 4.5 billion. And that's the year we're in. We're almost done with fiscal year 20. And the budget is 5.4 billion, and that's what they passed last year at this time. Supplementals were another almost 400 million for a total budget of 4.8. We will draw $1.3 billion in this fiscal year from our reserves. That's a little bit from the SBR, which is now completely exhausted, and the remaining from the CBR. Now the CBR and the SBR have been our traditional rainy day funds. And they had a balance of over $16 billion in 2014. Did I say 16 billion? A balance over $16 billion between the two. In fiscal year 21, revenues are projected at 4.2 billion. Of that 4.2 billion, 3.1 billion is from the percent of market value draw from the earnings. The budget passed is 5.1 billion. For a $968 million projected deficit right now. That doesn't count mini many items. So we'll go on to the next page, look at where our spending comes from. So I apologize, I lost a title in the middle graph. The first graph on the left are the largest budget operating items. The middle graph is all other operating agency items. And the graph on the right side are items we call statewide and capital. So if you look on the very left side, our three largest operating expenses for state funds, and this is only looking at what the state unrestricted general funds cover. The ones that are controlled largely by the legislature, and you know, if overspent, create the deficit. So we try to provide a perspective here. So I'm just going to isolate to that education and early childhood development on the far left side. Red bar is 2010, blue is 14, green is fiscal year 20, and fiscal year 21. So you can see that education has increased since fiscal year 2010, but has essentially flattened over that time period. Health and social services is actually declined since 2014 and continues to be relatively flat. That's still up from 2010. The next item is the dividend. So you can see in 2010, it was higher than it, or lower than it was in 2020, this last year. So it was lower than the $1,600 dividend. Also much lower than the 2014. That was the peak dividend in 2014, that blue bar. And then the purple bar for fiscal year 21, the one coming up, is a $1,000 dividend. That costs $635 million, $685 million, excuse me. So then you can see how large those are compared to all other agencies. So the university, steep declines since 2010. The only growing agencies are our public safety agencies. So public safety, corrections, and judiciary are the only kind of consistently growing entities. Then you have the natural resource agencies, natural resources, fish and game, DEC, then all others. And on the far right side, you have debt service, state retirement payments, oil and gas, and a capital budget. And you can see how dramatically the capital budget has declined as we've run into revenue problems. Just for reference, whoops, we lost the graph. Just for reference, I put in those horizontal lines. The top horizontal line, that kind of red line, shows the FY20 deficit at $1.3 billion. And the FY21 projected deficit of nearly $1 billion. You can see the scope of how many items would have to be eliminated to even come close to addressing that level of deficit. So a little bit about what's not in fiscal year 21. Community debt reimbursement, school debt reimbursement was vetoed by the governor. Community assistance was vetoed by the governor. Because of the timing, we had a very, very small capital budget. We would anticipate anywhere from $40 to $70 million more in a capital budget. There were no funds put forward to meet the statutory obligations of the oil and gas tax credits. So there's tremendous, there are many items in the 20 budget that will be hard to not come back and fund either as a supplemental or that will have to be seen as increases in fiscal year 22. Next slide. So what does that mean to our reserves? So we have, this is a look at our constitutional budget reserve. I had mentioned that our statutory budget reserve is completely depleted. It was used last year. The last 200 million was used last year to fund the $1,600 dividend, or part of the $1,600 dividend. But our constitutional budget reserve, which has some other rules attached to it, including a 3/4 vote to access it, had a starting balance of just under 2.3 billion, and at the beginning of the fiscal year that we're in right now. There's deposits and earnings. Deposits are any settlements from oil tax disputes, and then also earnings from investments. And that's a much smaller part, and a much smaller part given our recent market turmoil. There was a draw of $1.1 billion, and our ending balance will be 1.4. So on June 30, we expect it to be 1.4 billion. If we keep that optimistic oil price average in fiscal year 21, based on appropriations already made for the upcoming fiscal year, there will be a draw of 968 million and an ending balance of roughly 530 million. Now, of that 530 million, the state uses on a daily basis, a regular basis, about 500 for cash flow borrowing. The last audited statement had it at 464 million. So essentially, when we get down to the 500 million, it is functionally unavailable. And if we don't use it for cash flow borrowing, we need to use it. We need to find another solution for cash flow borrowing within the state. And this is cash flow borrowing is, you know, you're going to get revenue. It's just going to come in later in the year, and your expenses are are earlier. So you need something to cover your expenses, waiting for your revenue to come in. And that CBR has served as that. Once we draw it down, we won't get there. Now, if we have oil prices in the, you know, $15 and $20 a barrel oil, we will completely exhaust the CBR during this coming year. Next page. This shows the status of the permanent fund. People ask whether it's a financial reserve. I wouldn't say that the permanent fund is a financial reserve. The permanent fund is the source of over 60% of our annual revenue. And so it needs to be treated as such and very much protected. So you can see the permanent fund earnings reserve account there on the far left, then the total permanent fund value, and the fiscal year 20 ending value is expected to be 63.2 billion. And that total permanent fund value is what drives that percent of market value draw over to the far right side. So last fiscal year it was 2.7 billion drawn from the earnings reserve to fund government and dividends. The current year we're in now is 2.9 billion. The year coming up is almost 3.1 billion. And the reason it's going down in 22 is two reasons. One, we're drawing slightly less. Right now we're doing a 5-year average on 5.25%. We're going down to a 5-year average at 5% in 22. The other reason is the stock market crash that we've just experienced. the effects of that don't start until fiscal year 22. So that's a 50 million. The first year drop is 50 million. It'll be $300 million when that whole 5-year average runs in of what we've lost in just this market crash. So next page. So what does 22 look like? 22 starts a year from this July 1. If we had a flat budget from 21 with all of its missing items, and we funded 50% of school debt service, we would have a deficit of 300 million before paying a dividend. At a $1,000 dividend, we'd have a $1 billion deficit, similar to what we're facing today. Statutory dividend, at a statutory dividend, we'd have a deficit of 2.4 billion. That's 50% of our annual revenue is 2.4 billion, actually more than 50%. So, and now we don't have the luxury of the CBR, and we have these immense structural deficits in our budget. We have laws and statutes on the books that prescribe spending, education formula, Medicaid formula, child services formula, education funding, the list goes on of laws that we have on the books that says what we're going to do. So items for criminal justice system, those are all statutes on the books that drive the cost of government. And that we also have statutes on the books that drive revenue. For instance, the percent of market value draw that's providing 3.1 billion. We have the oil and gas tax laws. We have the marijuana tax laws. We have, many laws. What we've done up to this point is largely looked at the budget and not addressed the laws that drive the costs nor the revenue. And in order for us to address this true structural deficit, where we have more laws on the books that create expenditures than we have on the books that allow for revenue, until we fix that, there's no path to a balanced budget. So, and until we can get balance, we're going to continuously be fighting these budget reductions versus new and diversified revenue. And truly the only ways out are either lower costs or more revenue, or likely both, given the drop in oil price. The biggest thing that people need to understand is we are drawing over 3 billion every year from the permanent fund. That draw is a long-term sustainable draw, allowing the permanent fund to grow with inflation over time. So essentially it's as powerful in 10 years in terms of an annual revenue stream as it is today. If we overdraw, and just as an example, if we overdraw the permanent fund, in addition to that long-term sustainable draw by $1 billion, we lose $50 million a year forever in annual revenue. Just one draw. Next page. So where are we at? We've got extreme uncertainty in the oil market and in the economy in general. What we predict today is hard to say. Is it going to come true? But in terms of oil prices, I think we are into a new normal of less $40 or less. in the long term, not the $60 that kind of past projections have been built on. You know, everybody, you know, the big news is on the dividend formula. And as you saw, even with a zero dividend, we have a $300 million to a $500 million deficit to contend with. So there's no silver bullet. You can't just address one thing. And again, we talked about the structural imbalance. I won't go into that again. But it requires changes in the laws in order for us to get to this balancing point. And the statutory changes are hard. They require a lot of compromise. And, you know, you'll see in the short term, I think you'll continue to see shifts of cost to the local government, such as the recent veto of the debt reimbursement by the governor. Next page. So I wanted to close with, and I've left Cliff with very little time here. I want to close with a little bit about the money that's coming in for the CARES Act, and it is substantial money. It in no way will replace the cost to the economy of this stop, this business pause that we've had. But the CARES Act, which was a $2 trillion federal stimulus package, and other, I mean, there was CARES Act, but there were two other stimulus packages before that, and one that followed it. But there's funding for tribes, there's airport funding, there's funding to healthcare facilities, the stimulus check that many of you have received. There's been over $1 billion in the payroll protection program out to small businesses through SBA. All of that money went to individuals and businesses directly from the federal government. There's a lot of money that will flow through the state. The unemployment insurance, both for traditional unemployment insurance eligible people as well as those on the gig economy. There's additional Medicaid money, there's public health money, there's community grants, education's received money, the universities received money, airport and the transit systems have received money. And then there's other discretionary grants. We anticipate a total of about between 1.4 and 1.8 billion coming through the state, not counting the probably $2+ billion going directly to businesses and individuals and other entities, nonprofits and tribes in the state. So it's, although that sounds like a lot of money, relative to the economic impact we've felt thus far, it's not, but it can make a difference in getting the state back up and running. It's just not as much as you think it is. With that, Cliff, I'll turn it over and apologize for being windy.
No problem, Pat. Pat, I'm going to start off with 2 questions and then encourage people to ask us questions through the chat bar while I start my own presentation. The first question is just to make it sure that people understand the relationships here. And I may have missed it, but it's pretty clear to me that you used, the numbers you used for the budget were in so-called unrestricted general fund dollars, or UGF, which is as long as I've been working with the budget, the way that most people in Alaska talk about the budget and mean the budget when they refer to the budget. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
UGF, yeah.
It's the one that drives the deficit.
There you go. I think that sometimes people get confused because they start talking about overall state budgets, but that includes some federal funds that are very difficult for the legislature to direct it all right there for like a single purpose.
They
Yeah.
come with many strings attached, and you
Sure.
know, the biggest ones, of course, are transportation program and Medicaid.
Right. And then secondly, and it's a related point I want to make clear, is that the funding that the federal government is sending, some of which to the state of Alaska, the state government, it also comes with strings and restrictions. So some people might think, hey, we'll just take the money the federal government gives the state of Alaska and we'll use it to replace the lost oil revenue money or the lost other revenues the state's facing because of COVID-19, or just in general because the economy is slumped. And that's not exactly how it works precisely.
Well, it's explicitly at the packages to date, the federal packages today are explicitly not to be used for revenue replacement by government.
Right.
It's
Okay.
not, there is some provision for businesses, but for government, there is no revenue replacement. So the sales tax that, or the fish tax that communities have lost, or the bed tax, they are not eligible to replace that.
Well, thank you, Pat. Well, Pat's given a pretty grim presentation about our fiscal system, and I'm now going to give a pretty grim one about our economy, our virus-affected economy here in Alaska. So we can go to the next slide, please. I have mostly bad news with a few potential bright spots, and I wish I could be, yeah, I wish I could be cheerful and upbeat, but most of the news that I have is grim about our economy. So let's go to the third slide, please. I think that I would characterize the sectors of Alaska's economy now as the super bad, the bad, and the maybe not bad. The super bad are oil and tourism. The bad are commercial fishing and the state of Alaska's investments, which I'll explain to you the way they work in Alaska's economy. And then potential bright spots might include additional mining projects and some jobs from that, some additional military spending potentially, and the anticipated much larger federal bailout to come. That's why it's potential, because it hasn't happened yet. I'm going to start with oil. Oil is hammered globally. COVID-19 has slashed demand and thus prices to below $20 per barrel, most recently just below $15 per barrel. There's a price war making it worse, a price war waged by Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's also driving down prices. Additionally, we have a really weird temporary phenomenon where there's a combination of the shortage of physical storage for oil, like of tanks, and a broken futures market, which last month temporarily produced negative prices. As my wife, a Japanese food fan, pointed out, that for a while you were being paid to take oil away in some quarters of the market, and even the regular price of oil is lower now than a rainbow timber. Price of oil per barrel is now below that of a rainbow number 2 roll, as she pointed out. Next slide, please. Alaska's oil industry is hurting and could be hurt much more. The throughput, that's the volume of oil going through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS, is being cut by at least 20%. It's already cut in May by Alyeska, and announced cut by ConocoPhillips in June. Is going to cut it further. The June volume, I expect, will be 400,000 barrels or less. And it was already just about 500,000 barrels a day before COVID-19 hit, and we're heading to 400,000 or below here. And not just because of some summer maintenance, but because of the actual effects of the global pandemic on the demand for oil and some effects on reduced production. This COVID-19's effect on the price of oil has already cut jobs in Alaska in the oil patch, and also investment on Alaska's North Slope, and lower investment in ANS means that there's going to be future oil production in the future. As Pat has pointed out in earlier presentations, rigs have been laid down. Wells could actually be shut in and closed down at an actual price of $10 a barrel. And as I said recently, the actual price has been $15 or below. But if it was going to look like it was going to stay at $10 a barrel, you might have the wells being shut in. And although it's wild and really hard and difficult to do and speculative, it's possible at some point the pipeline itself could be shut down. At least one state legislators predicted that will happen this summer. But I want to point out, as someone who's worked in this area while working as a lawyer for the city of Valdez in pipeline property tax litigation and administrative proceedings, work I no longer do. But the question whether when or if TAPS would shut down is both an economic and an engineering question. And there are dollar and barrel thresholds, because it's not just that the price of oil would go so low that would cause TAPS to shut down. But at some point, if so little oil is running through TAPS, it might just get shut down because it's just hard to run at very low oil prices, even though it is oil companies and owners of the TAPS would be reluctant very reluctant to close it, because it's hard to start up again, and it's hard to start up all those wells you'd have to shut down as well. Next slide, please. In addition to all those short-term risks, there's long-term and medium-term risks for Alaska oil and gas. It's a big question of how long the demand for oil is going to stay down. Some people have wondered whether the lockdowns we're experiencing now will permanently increase telework and permanently lead people to reduce their driving for commuting or their business flying, and lead to a permanently reduced demand for oil. Oil already had substantial problems in the marketplace going forward in terms of climate change. And others have asked whether COVID-19 will combine with climate change to move up and speed up the process we've already seen of the shift away from fossil fuels, a shift that could hit Alaska oil particularly hard. And a number of people have been complained about big banks like Goldman Sachs and said, hey, they're unfair to Alaska by saying they're not going to invest in Arctic oil anymore. I'd ask if the stances of those big banks are like a canary in the coal mine, and are sort of like maybe in the 60s and 70s when airlines started to create smoking sections on airplanes and actually even banned smoking on airplanes. And well, those commercial signals in the marketplace are a real life factor telling us something about the future of long-term future of oil. And I would point out that if some oil is going to be left in the ground that's now ticketed to be developed, it would tend to be the oil that is higher cost, like Arctic oil, that might be some of the leading candidates to not be burned. Additionally, the pandemic is bad news for Alaska North Slope natural gas as well. There's been excitement ever since the 1970s in Alaska about building a project that would monetize or commercialize the very substantial deposits of natural gas on Alaska's North Slope. But the recent problems have become so bad that I will tell you that a business consultant told me recently that he thought it was more likely that gas would move from the south into Alaska. Natural gas would move from the south and go from Tacoma to Whittier to Fairbanks than it would go from as in so long hoped for from the North Slope down to Fairbanks. The world is just turned upside down in a lot of ways, folks. Next slide, please. Alaska tourism is also being just battered. Most tourists come to Alaska on cruise ships, and more than 2/3 of the cruise ship sailings, carrying more than half the passengers that were expected this year, have been canceled. Potential travelers are, not flying much as well. As the headline says, you can get on flights, but you get a whole bunch of elbow room. It's not many people on those flights. Long-term prospects for Alaska tourism are also in question for at least for a while, because most visitors are in the age range most affected by the pandemic. So, and people need to think really clearly about what that means. And I will say that I think that some longtime Alaska businesses that cater to tourists may go bankrupt soon, and they're very much hurting. Next slide, please. Although not as greatly, commercial fishing is harmed as well by this pandemic. Alaska seafood prices are down as much as 30%. I've worked briefly back in the 80s as in commercial fishing and seafood processing. That's close work. It's hard to make physical distancing and social distancing work there, and that just makes the supply difficult to supply difficult to fish and to process, to work in the processing line. Much of Alaska seafood is consumed in restaurants. About 2/3 of it, Alaska seafood is exported overseas. And restaurants are not doing well recently, as you've seen. And a lot of people are not spending a lot of the money they used to spend on fancy restaurant meals, including fish. And transportation and exporting to overseas markets may be compromised long-term through a process of turning inward that might come out of this pandemic. Next slide, please. The pandemic has also pummeled our investments. Pat's talked about this some, but it's important to understand that coronavirus is cutting investment returns, which, as Pat has pointed out repeatedly, are now the biggest source of state of Alaska revenues. And these reduced investment returns will have the effect over time of threatening Alaska jobs through a process that Pat described. This is also will come at a time when local governments are probably already cutting jobs due to dropping tax revenues, particularly sales tax revenues lost to the virus. And the coronavirus pandemic's effects on oil, tourism, commercial fishing, and investments have been called by a couple of friends of mine, Terry Gardner and Bob Waldrop. They say, well, it's like there's 4 simultaneously earthquakes that are hitting Alaska's economy all at the same time. And that's the way to understand what's happening with our economy. Next slide, please. Alaska's economy will probably be one of the hardest hit in the United States. I want to say that again, not our public health. Luckily, we've been spared the terrible deaths that have been seen in states, the large number of deaths have been seen in states like New York, New Jersey, or Louisiana, or Michigan, and some others. But our economy, because of our exposure to oil and tourism and somewhat to commercial fishing and investments, will be one of the hardest hit in the United States. And I think it's also important to point out that although we've had a lot of bad news about COVID-19, the overall public health scenario in the United States is not as bad in the views of many people as it looked 2 months ago. About 2 months ago, there was a lot of talk that we might, have 500,000, 1 million, or 2 million people die in the United States. That does from COVID-19. That does not look, anywhere as likely now. But even though the public health scenarios in the United States as a whole have improved in the last 2 months, note that Alaska's economic outlook due to the virus, particularly with oil and tourism, has gotten increasingly dark. It seems like the news has gotten worse every week the last 2 months about oil and tourism, and sometimes every day. And I want to talk about a difficult topic, but I think it's important to look straight in the eye here. Some people have talked about population decline as a way that will reduce the problems for both Alaska's fiscal system and Alaska's economy. And I've heard people tell me that even before COVID-19 hit. And I want to stress, I don't mean that COVID-19 is going to kill a number of people in Alaska, because it does not look like it will. But I do think, as I said, that COVID-19 is helping to slam the Alaska economy really hard. That was not an economy that was not in great shape before COVID-19 hit. And as a result, you're going to have some people leave, some people increased out-migration, and probably reduced in-migration that's already occurring. And that will reduce the Alaska population, which is in recent years already been falling. But if you think of that as maybe a strategy that will help our economy and our fiscal system, I'd say, hold your horses, think twice, because population decline is a double-edged sword for Alaska's economy, because it both reduces the burden on the government, but it also simultaneously reduces retail demand, it reduces local tax revenues, reduces real estate values here in Alaska, and then it hurts the fiscal system because it reduces, frankly, the number of potential state taxpayers that would, maybe pay a broad-based tax when Alaska gets one. Alaska being the only state in the United States that has no form of a broad-based tax. Every other state has an individual income tax or a statewide sales tax, or both. Next slide, please. So now, okay, let's get to a few potential bright spots. There may be additional mining projects that go forward as a result of COVID-19, perhaps with a focus on critical minerals considered critical to either national security or the economy. This will partly come through what I've called the great turn inward, the sort of desire of a number of Americans maybe to bring international supply chains home and try to get minerals in the United States that are now mined in places like China or Africa. Mining has a whole host of issues associated with it that I'm not going to go into, but there may be some additional jobs created through the development of additional mines in Alaska, particularly those that would produce perhaps critical minerals. There may be additional military spending caused by COVID-19. Out of an anger at China, out of increased international tensions, out of some sort of feelings of xenophobia, that there may be more spending on the military in Alaska beyond what we already have as a result of the pandemic, and that might create some jobs. And then there's the wild card, which are grants from Congress, loans from the United States Federal Reserve to the state of Alaska, perhaps, and also to businesses in Alaska. And some people have likened this perhaps flow and very substantial, greater flow of federal money into Alaska is similar to what happened to Alaska after the 1964 earthquake, the enormous Good Friday earthquake in March of 1964 that produced a lot of federal funding for reconstruction of Alaska. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that some of that money flowing in from federal bailout money into Alaska businesses might prop up some zombies. And I've heard that there's some business consultants who are talking to businesses in Alaska, their clients, trying to advise them between whether they should either go all out for federal bailout money to survive or instead declare bankruptcy. And people need to think clearly about what will happen as a result of, if that federal bailout money does come in large amounts, what effects it will have. So I'm going to defer to Hannah and let Hannah ask questions that could come for either Pat or me about Alaska's fiscal circumstances or about our economic circumstances. Hannah?
Thank you, Cliff. We did have a couple come in, so thank you for participating. This first one is from board member Helen Nienhauser, and it's for Pat. Can you speak to the state of retirement funds? Are they safe or threatened?
So they're safe. The state pays, in addition to the employer rate and the employee rate, the state pays an on-behalf payment of roughly $350 million a year. If you look back on the graphs, you can see the retirement line item. And that is after a $3 billion deposit in 2015 into the retirement system funds. But they are safe because they're constitutionally protected. The other thing is the market uncertainty that rocked our world here a month ago. Both the retirement system and the permanent fund have not lost significant dollars. They were not as exposed as I personally was in the market. And so, they're breaking even. So we entered this fiscal year with 66 billion in the permanent fund, and it ended at it will end with 63 billion after drawing out 3 billion for the draw. So there's not a ton of loss, and the ARM board is actually tracking very close to that rate. So I would say safe for two reasons. We've staved off the loss of the market drop, and also those funds are constitutionally protected.
Thank you, Pat. I'm going to go ahead and follow. This is partial comment, but also includes a bit of a question from Leslie Kleinfeld. She says, so clearly it's time for Alaska to diversify our economy away from oil. Time for oil companies to invest in clean energy solutions? Yes, question mark. And Leslie has a follow-up from Lizzie who says, Leslie, we'll need to capture revenue from those clean energy sources. Would either one of you care to comment towards those?
I would say that Alaska needs to look very closely, as Pat has suggested, at our revenue structure, both in terms of taxes paid by individuals, which are very low. There are no, as I keep saying, there are no broad-based taxes in Alaska paid by individuals, but also by industries, because our state is hurting, and the deficits are going to get larger and larger. And I want to add, as Pat has said, the projections for the deficits, if anything, in the future are optimistic. They're way likely to be surprises more on the downside than the upside. I mean, more negative surprises than positive surprises, in part because some people wonder that if the permanent fund and the pension funds will be able to make as much money in the stock markets and real estate markets going forward, and whether that also some of the losses in the real estate markets, especially for the permanent funds invested, have been actually, we've had time to capture them yet, because a lot of this, the COVID-19 economic problems and roiling of the financial markets have just become so fast that, not all the losses have been captured. So like I said, if you're going to expect surprises, they're probably more going to be on the negative side.
Okay, the next question is from Chest Rockwell. How much of an impact will the tax revenue from the mining sector make in the larger budget picture?
I'm going to let Pat start with that.
So I looked at some numbers on the potential for the Donlin mine. And at full maturity, it was in the $50 million range. So that's if you have a whole, everything continues to stay the same, and then you bring a whole new highly productive mine into the scheme. And it was 50 to 70 million. I could get exact numbers from Department of Natural, well, not exact numbers because it doesn't exist yet, but their projections based on the resource base. But that one's several years out, and you're looking at at $50 million, and we have a $500 million deficit. So one mine, and so you'd need 10 of those to make up that deficit. Just for perspective, the gasoline tax that was proposed, an increase of 8 cents, would have been about $30 million. So $30 million against a $500 million shortfall. So it's the magnitude is something that all taxes aren't created equally, and not every industry can bear huge amounts, and so it's going to have to be several small chunks in several ways.
Thanks, Pat. And just to let everyone know, I'm going to ask these in order that they came in. So I know some people have follow-up questions to what was just talked about, but I'm going to go ahead and order. The next one is from Harold Johnston to everyone. How much risk is there that the permanent fund will be viewed by the federal government as the primary source of rescue funds, and therefore we are not eligible for federal funds until the fund is depleted?
I'll let Pat take that one too.
The state doesn't get a lot of sympathy in Washington, but I also don't see that would be used as a case not to fund Alaska. I think the hardest thing is, in the Exxon oil spill and the earthquake, Alaska got a lot of money, but there wasn't the other states weren't going through major crisis like they are. And I think, we've, as a state, have fared fairly well with the coronavirus itself. I mean, our economy is going to take a significant hit, but from a public health crisis, we've fared as well as any other state. And so, I think it is, we can expect some federal dollars, but we're going to have to figure out how to get ourselves out of the economic trough.
Okay, the next question is coming in from Terry Gardner. What is the range of additional funds that will be appropriated, including supplemental for fiscal year 21, minimum to maximum?
That's obviously a question for Pat.
I would say a minimum of 100, because we, who knows what the fire season's going to be like. It was $110 million last year just for fires. I would say a minimum of 100 and a maximum of, it depends on what the decisions are on the COVID relief. So maximum could be substantial. I'm not gonna foreshadow a maximum, but I think the normal supplementals and minimum issues is going to be at least 100 for supplementals.
Thank you. The next question is from another participant whose name I don't know, unfortunately. If the state takes $2 billion more from the permanent fund than is sustainable, would that be an annual reduction of $100 million a year in future sustainable earnings?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Forever, not just 1 year, forever. $100 million out of that annual revenue stream forever.
The next is just a comment from Leslie referring back to your projection on Donlin. She says, does this projection about Donlin, for example, take into account the cost of environmental devastation these huge mines cause?
It does not.
Moving on. Next question is last one. Sounds like we've got one from Mike. Are the vertically integrated oil companies going to be less impacted by low oil prices versus ConocoPhillips, who is a production company? What will drive ANS production? Or will that drive ANS production? Sorry, excuse me.
Pat, I'll let you take it. I give a brief answer, which you could supplement.
All right.
My understanding is that the vertically integrated companies, and to be more precise, the companies that both produce oil in our slope and own a share of the pipeline are somewhat more protected because they get revenues from owning the share of the pipeline. The smaller independents might be more exposed. That's the speculation I've heard from observers of the oil patch. Pat may have some additional comments about that.
Yeah, I think that it's the choice. The low price will stall investment choices, and those companies that are large and have the capital backing, have substantial capital, will survive a low price environment longer than the small producers that are exposed. And in terms of like the vertical, whether you have a refinery in California or part of the pipeline, if you have part of the pipeline, you probably have a lot of capital. And so I think it really is much more about how much capital backing do you have to weather this storm going forward.
So go ahead, Cliff, if you want to
I
finish.
think that we're nearing or at the end, Hannah.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to wrap this up by turning this over to Dick. I very much want to thank Pat Pitney again. I want to thank all the participants who asked questions, not all of which we got, but to answer, I think. But I very much appreciate those who were interested enough to participate in this event and attend it. And I'm going to give it back to our chair, Dick Malleus.
Hey, Pat and Cliff, thank you very much for that informative, although alarming presentation. And I especially want to thank Pat for taking the time out of her busy schedule down there in Juneau to be with us tonight. Missing from this Zoom session is the round of applause that you should be hearing right now.
That's for Pat, for me.
And finally, our election results. We completed the election. All the board members were reappointed and the new board members were approved, and we had a unanimous vote in support of the bylaw changes. So Katie Doherty, Cliff Groh, and Janet McCabe, congratulations on being reelected, and Alyssa Bish and Bill Hall, congratulations on being confirmed as new board members, although Bill is actually returning after a few years break, but congratulations to all of you. And as I mentioned, our bylaws were approved by unanimous vote, so they're passed. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
This is Mary Lou Harrell. I move to adjourn this annual meeting of Alaska Common Ground.
And I second.
Okay, the meeting's adjourned, and I want to thank you all for your support and for attending. If you're not a member, please go to our website and sign up for Alaska Common Ground. Everyone, please stay healthy, stay engaged in these issues, and we hope to see you all in person soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Hannah, you are awesome.
Yes, Hannah, thank you. Alyssa, thank you for your work. Cliff, thank you for putting that all together. And again, if Pat's still on the line, a huge thank you for participating.
Awesome job, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Dick. Nice job.
Yes.
Thank you.
Job running it all. And gosh, definitely could not have done it without my co-hosts of Hannah and Alyssa, who made everything run smoothly.
That was fun.
Corey, you did an amazing job.
I was busy helping people get onto the meeting as time was going on. So I've definitely learned a thing or two, and I'm frozen, I think. But I've definitely learned a thing or two about how to set these up. We'll see how the next one goes.
No, I thought it went well, and I think doing the rehearsal